So hello, everyone, and welcome again. My name is Dan Pierce, and I'm one of the founders of Mentally Fit. Today, we have an excellent talk lined up for you, and our guest here, as you know, is Andy Norman. He's an award-winning author, professor of philosophy at the Carnegie Mellon University in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania. And today, we're here to talk about Andy's new book and the concept of mental immunity, which is also the book title. So, Andy, welcome. Thanks so much for joining us today.
Thanks, Dan. It's nice to be here.
Yeah. So tell us about mental immunity, like in a nutshell, what is it?
Yeah. So it turns out that just as the body has an immune system that protects us against infectious microbes, our minds have immune systems that protect us from infectious ideas. Now, the research on this actually goes back about 60 years, but not many people have yet framed the thing as straightforwardly as I just did. Ideas have bad ideas, especially the infectious ones, have all the properties of mind parasites. They can sweep through human populations, infect minds, get people to spread those ideas to other minds. And so I actually think that it's time we woke up and started thinking of bad infectious ideas as mind parasites and start thinking of the mental mechanisms that we use to filter those ideas, and in some cases, spot and remove them. We need to start thinking of those as mental immune systems. And when you do that, you start seeing all kinds of interesting ways in which we can go far beyond what we learned in critical thinking courses in college. So I believe that our mental immune systems can function at a much higher level than they tend to, and protect us against bad ideas, and help us spot and fill our minds with good ideas.
Nice, love that. Yeah, I mean, I was really drawn to the simplicity of it. You know, we've all been through the last year, we had the pandemic. So everyone by now is familiar with the idea of immune systems and how you can build them. So I think it's a very helpful framework for people and for all of us to understand just sort of how our minds process new information, how we compare that new information to our existing beliefs.
Exactly.
Yeah, it's very, very detailed and very cool in that way. So can you talk a little bit, it's like, how did you come to write this book? You mentioned before we got on live here that it's been in the works for about 30 years for you. In the last 5 or so of actually writing it, what has been the experience that led up to writing Mental Immunity?
Yeah, so I think it was one of those all-night dorm bull sessions back in college where I was complaining about humanity's sorry lack of wisdom. And a friend of mine turned to me and said, Andy, why don't you quit complaining and do something about it? And I declared myself as a philosophy major a couple of weeks later. And ever since then, I've been trying to figure out what wisdom is and how I can acquire just a little bit and how I can help others acquire a bit more of it. And after I became a professor and started teaching critical thinking, I realized that standard approaches to teaching critical thinking just aren't doing enough to protect our minds from the kind of viral nonsense that spreads now across the internet. And I happened to hit on this idea that minds have immune systems. I came across it in an article I was reviewing, and I took it into the students of my critical thinking class, and I said, hey guys, can a mind become infected? And the students looked puzzled and said, you mean a brain? And I was like, no, I mean a mind. And they said, infected with what? And I said, bad ideas. And they broke into groups and talked. This was in the early 90s, but the internet hadn't become kind of a major feature of our lives back then. And so they broke into groups and they discussed it for 15, 20 minutes. And they came back and said, yeah, it kind of makes sense to us that minds can become infected with bad ideas. And I said, all right, well, which of your beliefs are legit and which of them are mere mind infections? And then you should have heard the quiet just settle over the class. And at that point in the term, we set aside our textbooks and we actually studied how the body's immune system works. And we learned that antibodies are like these mobile shock troops that course through our bloodstreams and attacking dangerous microbes and helping to keep us healthy. The students and I decided that questions and reasons are the antibodies of the mind, and that if we use them properly, we can do a better job of ridding ourselves of the kind of ideas that frustrate our own goals. So we actually developed a simple game that lets us test ideas with questions and reasons. And I drew from my background in logic and epistemology, the branch of philosophy that thinks about these things, to fine tune this game. And the kids just loved it. And they just came alive to the fun and the challenge of idea testing in a supportive, collaborative way.
So how does this differ from traditional ways of critical thinking? How does it add to that?
Yeah, so the focus of traditional approaches to critical thinking involves trying to impart skills. And the thing about skills is you can have them and not use them. Or even worse, you can use them selectively. So here's what a lot of people do. They go to college and they figure out ways to poke holes in arguments, and then they use those skills to poke holes in other people's thinking without turning them on their own thinking.
Yeah.
So if you equip somebody that way, you're actually creating something like a skilled propagandist rather than a genuinely fair-minded thinker. And so we need more than skills. We need the right sensibilities. We need the right habits. We need fair-mindedness. We need humility. All of these things are ingredients of what I call mental immune health, because our minds don't do a good job of filtering out bad ideas if we don't develop them. But if you study the problem of how you inoculate minds or free minds from bad ideas through the lens that this immunology paradigm offers, you just start seeing all these ways in which we're failing to do enough.
Yeah. Yeah, I can definitely see that. We've all experienced a lot of challenges over the last year. And a lot of the challenges have been in relation to other people and their opinions. And, we might differ with their opinion. So with so many versions of the truth, it's said that we live in this post-truth era, right? With so many people's versions of reality and versions of the truth out there, how do we define what's true, what's false, or what's good and what's bad?
Right. Yeah, that's a key philosophical question for anybody with a project like mine. So the first thing to see is that good idea doesn't have to mean idea I happen for any arbitrary reason approve of. And bad idea doesn't happen to mean just idea I don't like. Instead, we can use those terms in disciplined ways to refer to ideas that are genuinely useful and true on the good side, and genuinely false or harmful on the other. So there are ideas that are just objectively problematic. And so if I want to indulge in misogynistic delusions, I might get a cheap sense of superiority, but I'm actually sowing dysfunction in society and harming others in the process. That is an objectively bad idea, because the idea has those causal properties. So what philosophers have been doing a long time is saying we don't have to treat the goodness and badness of ideas as merely subjective. We can instead study the properties of ideas and determine, using clear, careful inquiry, whether those ideas are serving us well or not. And if you make that switch from values are merely subjective to, some ideas really do serve us better than others, you can begin to approach the task of idea assessment in something like a scientific way. And we desperately need that kind of, it's not perfect objectivity, but it's a kind of objectivity that we can approach and get better at if we practice the art.
Yeah, and it sounds like a big part of the art of practicing mental immunity or good mental immune health is just coming to the table with an open mind and in the spirit of looking to expand your knowledge and perhaps even be willing to update your old beliefs.
That's exactly right. When culture wars break out and we become scared and defensive, we tend to approach contentious political or religious conversations fearful of what we tend to treat information coming from the other side as a threat. And when you react to new information as a threat, your mind's immune system kicks into overdrive and attacks it. So the science of immunology took a big leap forward about 130 years ago, I think, when a Russian zoologist took a citrus thorn and he stabbed a starfish and stuck it under a microscope. And he actually witnessed white blood cells swarm to the scene of the injury and try to neutralize the tip of the thorn. He was the first human being ever to witness the body's immune system in action. Now, think of the last time somebody presented sort of a strident expression of a political viewpoint on the other side from the other side of the political spectrum. If you're liberal, imagine a strident pro-Trump position, or if you're a conservative, a strident anti-Trump position, whatever it is. When somebody offers that kind of perspective, we tend to feel defensive, right? And our mental immune systems start to generate antibodies, objections, challenges, suspicions, reasons to dismiss the other person as not worth listening to. And when these things swarm into our minds, they prevent us from thinking in a fair-minded way. So when accusations of racism or accusations of libtards or whatever are flying fast and thick, our mental immune systems can't function properly. In fact, mental immune performance can degrade rapidly in a politically contentious environment. So a big part of promoting mental immune health is creating spaces where we can actually have constructive dialogue again.
Yeah, that's a really great point. I was actually going through the news this morning, which is, I don't love doing that all the time, but sometimes I read the news, and sometimes even worse, I read the comments under them. And as I'm reading the comments on these news stories, I'm just like I feel disappointed and like tired reading these comments back and forth, like, and using those ways of thinking, but in weaponized ways, by poking holes in other people's arguments, but not even trying to look at their own side of things or their own arguments. And it feels like a lot of the surface conversation is that very frenetic and not factual based, and many of them are not coming to the table trying to find a solution. It's just attack. How do we make space for these rational conversations in that environment?
Yeah, I got to say, first of all, that I completely share your experience. Both just reading the news every day takes an emotional toll now. And I've kind of started to notice how reading about contentious political issues can leave me feeling. And I don't think I'm at my best when I have the sort of depressing picture of human nature that, flame wars expose me to, right?
Yeah.
I start to become really cynical about human nature and our collective prospects. But we don't have to focus obsessively on all this toxicity that's dividing us. In fact, it's healthy to pull back from that and meet with friends and just talk in gentle, respectful ways, and trying to develop your own understanding by hearing what the questions and objections that others have. If you practice that first and foremost with your close friends, you can start to feel comfortable enough and skilled enough at it so that you can start doing it with more distant friends and eventually with strangers. And I know people who've been practicing this art for so long that they can go, I know a Black man who met with a KKK Grand Cyclops and deconverted the guy. I'm talking about Daryl Davis, who you may have read about.
Yeah, I read the article. Very interesting. For those that don't know, could you tell us about the story there?
Yeah, so Daryl Davis was a Black blues musician, still is, I guess. But he was having a beer at a bar when a white guy came over to him and started talking to him. And it turned out later that the guy was like a grand cyclops or some exalted position within the KKK. And Daryl Davis had the presence of mind and the patience to just listen to the guy and just try to understand where he was coming from. And the more he gave this guy, they ended up meeting several times outside later. And Daryl had this white supremacist over to his house for a beer. And eventually the guy, he just listened to the guy to the point where the guy could start hearing for himself how nonsensical his own ideas were. Before the show, you and I were talking about motivational interviewing. I think Daryl Davis is just kind of an intuitive master in a way at motivational interviewing, this process of just trying to hear and understand not just a person's explicit views, but the underlying motivations behind them, so that you can express sympathy for the real needs that are trying to meet, even with these dysfunctional ideas or beliefs. And then when you've won somebody's trust, you can begin to suggest alternatives that might serve them equally well without entangling them in the kind of political toxicity or racist toxicity or whatever else might be serving them and others badly.
Yeah, that's a really great example. And for anyone out there who's interested in learning more of that, definitely check out that story. It's very interesting how, yeah, a Black guy and a KKK member walk into a bar. It almost sounds like a bad joke, right? But then the KKK member actually gave away his Klansman robes to Daryl, gave up, renounced his membership, and yeah, totally came around to the other side. So there is power in being able to empathetically listen to somebody, make them feel heard, and motivationally interview or lead them with questioning about their thoughts so they can see a different perspective.
Yeah, almost nobody is eager to let you change their mind until you've shown them that you can listen patiently and understand their mind.
Yeah.
And in a way, you have to earn your permission to try to persuade them with patience and respect.
Yeah, that's a good point. So for everyone else, what does this look like? What is the process of mental immunity and fact checking our own ideas? Like, how do we go about going through this process with our own thoughts?
Yeah. So let's see where to begin. I think I would say the first thing to understand is that doubts are your mind's antibodies. And if you have doubts, even little tiny, barely audible, if there's a little tiny voice in the back of your head saying, this doesn't seem quite right, learn to listen to that voice, because it's actually trying to draw your attention to something important. And when we tune out that voice, our ability to spot bad ideas declines, which is to say our mental immune systems don't cease functioning as well. But if you learn to listen to those things, your nonsense detector gets more sensitive and you begin to become a wiser person. It's also really important to steer clear of the kind of debates where you're trying to defeat somebody with your reasons. So I like to say that reasons aren't weapons. They're tools for guiding a friend's attention to a relevant consideration, or an acquaintance's attention to a relevant consideration. If you remember to treat reasons as tools for collaboration rather than as weapons, you'll start to reason collaboratively, and you'll start to derive all kinds of psychological and social benefits from the kind of conversations you're having. I think it's also really important to remember that your beliefs are not you. The beliefs you happen to have taken on or that have formed in your mind probably aren't serving you as well as some of the alternatives out there. And so it's really important not to jump into their defense at the drop of a hat and do battle for your beliefs. It's much more interesting and much more beneficial to treat challenges to your beliefs as opportunities instead of threats.
Mm.
And if you do these handful of simple things like this, in the book, I offer 12 steps to rigorous mental immune health or robust mental immune health. But those are some of my top 3, I would say, things you can do to begin strengthening your mental immune system before noon tomorrow.
Nice. I love that. Yeah. What really drew me to this heavily, and I knew we had to have you in for a podcast and for a talk here, was how similar mental immunity is to just mental health and all of the things we talk about in relation to mental health on a daily basis. You mentioned motivational interviewing. That's one thing that you can do to sort of have those constructive dialogues. Another skill I use all the time is sort of fact checking. I used to have a hard time with emotion regulation. It was just not something I learned until I did learn the skill of emotion regulation, where, if you have, emotions are always preceded by an event where you have a thought and then an emotion comes from the thought. But if you can change the thought, then you can change the emotion.
That's beautifully said. I love that. And we have this weird kind of dual picture of the mind in some ways. When it comes to learning and information, we think of the mind as like a knowledge receptacle. It's like learning is filling the bucket of the mind, right? But then emotions, that's somehow governed by irrational processes that we need mental health professionals to help us with. The fact is, I think, long before psychology even existed as a discipline, people sought out philosophers, people with my training, to try to think more clearly and in more fruitful ways about stuff. And if it turns out that if you don't fill your heads if you keep your head from filling up with a lot of nonsense, a lot of the emotional problems will just go away.
Yeah.
Which isn't to say there isn't a great deal of need for people who can deal with trauma and people who can understand how to help people deal with strong emotions. That's not my expertise. But you're absolutely right that a lot of strong emotions originate in ideas or thoughts that don't have to control us. And we can become more mindful of them and prevent them from triggering kind of a runaway emotional response.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, that's great that, it's a good point that you pointed out that people used to seek out philosophers for these kinds of things, because there was a point where philosophy was science, and then science was like, only these things that can be proven in this format are science. So it kind of branched off into all these other disciplines.
I like to say that philosophy is the incubator of the sciences. I think there's a lot of truth to that. Most of the sciences today were once the jurisdiction of so-called natural philosophy. We passed on the art of empirical idea testing to scientists a few centuries ago during the scientific revolution. But since then, we philosophers have remained very interested in testing moral convictions and value judgments and ideas about how to reason properly. What's the difference between knowledge and mere opinion? These are the questions that remain philosophers' bailiwick, and it's still important that we think clearly about those things too.
Yeah. So you mentioned also things that can disrupt your mental immune system. What are those things that might get in the way of mental immunity, or might lead the way for those infectious ideas to enter?
Yeah, so I have this category, right, called mental immune disruptor. And I argue that there are a bunch of things at large in our culture that are weakening our mental immune systems. So just to help you get your head around the concept, just think about the idea that I have all the answers. If that idea takes roots in your mind, you lose curiosity. And if you lose curiosity, you stop learning. And if you're not learning, your mental immune system isn't, your mind, you're not giving your brain the operating system updates that it needs to live in a changing world, right? So that's a clear example of an immune disruptive idea. But in my book, I identify many others. One of them that I think is particularly worrisome is the idea that I'm entitled to my opinions. So this idea has functioned to sort of express the idea that governments shouldn't create thought police and try to regulate the contents of our minds. And that's all well and good. But when the idea that I'm entitled to my opinions becomes an excuse for indulging in irresponsible and belief, it becomes dysfunctional. And right now, I feel like we live in a culture where we talk endlessly about our mental and cognitive rights. We pay almost no attention at all to our cognitive responsibilities. And the rights responsibilities balance is way out of whack. I think there's a big imbalance there. And that's one reason so many people feel entitled to whatever their ideology happens to be. But it doesn't take any great intelligence to see that 1,000 different worldviews, each claiming to be right and claiming to be, something you're entitled to, is not a recipe for civic harmony.
That's a tough one. And yeah, that's definitely one of the parts of this whole concept that I struggle with the most, as I've been learning about it and just considering how society is, not just in the US, but across the world. We are so different. We don't even really have a universal understanding of what reality is, of how things should be. So it's very hard to have these conversations about, what is right, what is acceptable. And I know you're not advocating for any kind of, thought police. You go out of your way in many interviews, that I've seen to say exactly the opposite of that. You're not advocating for that. What you are advocating for is people to come to the table with good intentions and being willing to grow. Is that accurate?
That's exactly right. And part of that is actually being, tolerant of objections that make us uncomfortable. So there's a lot of talk of sort of safe spaces. We need to create spaces where nobody feels the least bit uncomfortable about the challenges or questions that others raise. That is not a recipe for learning. Anybody who's spent any amount of time in the teaching profession knows that you have to create conversational discomfort to get people to think deeply about things. So we need to move beyond this current ethos that treats every piece of information that might conceivably cause offense, that treats all of that as impermissible. That's not a well-functioning set ethos, and we need to replace it with one where vigorous idea testing is welcomed, and each and every one of us understands that our ideas are not us. So when you train as a philosopher, people challenge the heck out of your ideas, and you have to distinguish between you and your ideas, or you start to feel really embattled. And that's part of a philosopher's training. And I think if we can all embrace the same basic insight, right? Our ideas don't define us. And if we hold them loosely and we part with them easily, when the right reasons come along, we become better versions of ourselves. But when we cling to bad ideas or suboptimal ideas and reject challenging information, we start to slide down a path towards a much darker and worse version of ourselves.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. I just want to address everyone in the audience watching real quick. Does all this make sense so far? Leave us a yes in the chat. Would love to know if we're on the same page. But yeah, it makes sense to me. Andy, people don't like having their beliefs challenged, right? As it's natural for all of us that there's a term for it in psychology, cognitive dissonance.
Yes.
We feel threatened and react when our beliefs are challenged. How do you think we can bring more people to the table? I mean, obviously your book is going to make a big impact just for people to be aware of it. But how do we bring more people who are not necessarily currently willing to look at their beliefs? Like, how do we lead them to being willing to examine their own belief systems?
Yeah.
Just to look at it.
Yeah, that's a really hard question, and one that think I've only got a piece of the answer to. When I went into philosophy, I wanted to sort of study fruitful dialogue. So where many of so epistemology is the branch of philosophy that studies how reasoning and inquiry work. And many of my colleagues in epistemology want to understand how inquiry arrives at truth, or how do we arrive at truth. But I'm interested both in whether the ideas that fill our heads are true, and I'm also interested in whether the ideas that fill our heads are useful.
Mm.
And it turns out that the sciences have traditionally looked at what I call upstream evidence, the evidence that either lends support to our beliefs or fails to. But the religions of the world have traditionally looked at sort of the downstream psychological and social benefits of certain beliefs and argued that certain beliefs are permissible or a good idea because they have those effects on our behavior. I think wisdom has to learn from both science and religion. We need to become attuned both to the evidence basis of our ideas and also attuned to the utility or functional significance of our ideas. And when we pay attention to both of those things, a lot of if you realize that both of those sets of considerations matter, you start to hear that people on the other side of the political aisle, for example, are actually making valid points. So here's what often a lot of political conversations go off the rails in the following way. Progressive comes along and says, this aspect of the system isn't working well, let's change it. Conservative hears that, and the suggested change, they worry that the suggested change might bring about unintended consequences or side effects that would leave us even worse off. So a lot of times progressives look at the upstream evidence for why we do need to change, and conservatives are looking at the downstream consequences of the change proposal. Each side has relevant considerations to bring to bear, and we need to learn to listen to both. And until we can do that, so I think that I offer some conceptual tools in the book for actually how we can begin listening and actually learning from people again on the other side of the political divide. And my fervent hope is that we can actually replace the dysfunctional partisan discourse in our country today with the kind of dialogue that brings people together again.
Excellent. Yeah, I really hope that happens. I think I speak for myself, and maybe other people feel this way as well, but just very tired of all the drama. Like, don't we have bigger things to worry about, bigger issues to tackle? I would love to see more cooperation on the political spectrum. I mean, obviously, just so many things going on. But to spin it in a positive note, what are some ideas, some mental, like if there's a mental virus out there, what's the opposite of that where it's a positive idea that catches on? What are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, so I think that we can, in the same way that we can boost our body's immune system with, for example, the COVID vaccine, we can boost our mind's immune system with something like a mind vaccine. So I argue that the famous Socratic method, right? This is the approach to idea testing pioneered by Socrates, the ancient Greek philosopher. He basically operated on the principle that if an idea can't withstand questioning, you should probably don't rely on it. It's not a good idea to rely on it. And that idea has inspired scientists and philosophers, millions of people ever since. I argue that that's one of the most powerful mind inoculants ever invented. But you can take an inoculant and refine it and turn it into something even more powerful, namely a vaccine. And vaccines are highly processed versions of inoculants. So in the final chapters of my book, I take the Socratic method and say, hey, we can take this and make it even stronger. We can make it an even better, we can make it so that it activates our mental immune systems to an even higher degree. So I come up with what I call the new Socratic method, which owes most of its wisdom to Socrates, but that also enhances it in ways that might actually help us climb out of this partisan rabbit hole we've managed to fall into.
Yeah. I think one new idea that we could all adopt is that we should do this. We should want to engage in this kind of reasoning, because just holding on to those old ideas just because, like you said, they're there because they're there, but they're not open to questioning or reasoning. That to me keeps us stuck opposed to moving us forward.
Yeah. And honestly, I get swept up in the partisanship of the Trump years, the same way many people did, and I found myself, saying things and thinking things that, on reflection, were not exemplars of fair-mindedness. Right? I fall into that trap as well, but I try to modulate my partisanship. I make a concerted effort to see things from other points of view. I make a point of trying to welcome unwelcome reasons. So a reason that might challenge my point of view, my initial emotional response might be negative, like, oh, that's nonsense, or oh, that's right wing, or oh, that's from a Trumpy, or whatever. But if I can step back from that, calm my mental immune system and say, maybe there's something I can learn from this, and I can listen to it, hear it in a different way. And one of the things I discovered teaching philosophy is that lots of times students have an insight, but sometimes they express it clumsily. When you're trying to express your ideas about justice or knowledge or right and wrong for the first time as an undergrad, as a freshman in college, a lot of times you say things in a way that's kind of doesn't really withstand scrutiny. But almost always, the student has something worthwhile to say. And if you can just help them say it better, they'll go, oh, thank you. That's what I meant to say. And if you bring that same attitude towards conversations with people on the other side of the political or even the religious secular divide, you can begin to build bridges, the kind of bridges that can heal our culture and our world.
I love that. Well said. And I really respect you for, being open about the fact that you're prone to these types of that type of thinking as well, as we all are. It's just the human condition, part of the human condition. And the more we can just be aware of it, bring that awareness to it, and fact check our thinking, the better off we're going to be.
And always reason to find out. Don't reason to win. Right? Treat reasons as collaboration tools, not as weapons. And I think that alone can take us a long ways in the right direction.
Well said. Well, I think that's a good one to wrap things up on. For anyone who wants to learn more about you, your work, where can we send them? Other than obviously check out the book. It's on Amazon and everywhere books are sold. Where can we send them to learn more and connect with you?
Yeah, the book represents my most fully thought out treatment of these issues. So that's a good place to start. But you can also learn a little bit about my work and my some of the podcasts and radio and TV appearances I've done by visiting my website at andynorman.org. And I'm trying to create a following on Facebook that's interested in helping me bring about what I call the cognitive immunology revolution. There's this new science emerging. I call it cognitive immunology. And as it develops and we begin to apply its principles, I think we can change the world. And if you're at all inspired to get involved with something like that, look up Andy Norman author on Facebook, and get involved with the small community of people who are passionate about this kind of thing.
Excellent. I'll definitely be joining that community. And once I get the links, I'll include all the links in the show notes once we post this video. So check those out. I do see we have some questions from the audience if you've got some time.
I do, but hey, one quick thing, Dan, let me
Yeah,
mention one more thing that I should have mentioned.
sure.
I'm starting a nonprofit think tank to develop the science of cognitive immunology, and I'm trying to bring together change agents who want to apply these principles to heal our world. And if you'd like to learn more about that, go to cognitivimmunology.net. And that's offers a whole another set of ways to get involved.
Excellent. Yeah, and this is as you said, it's a budding and emerging science. You're really doing scientific research on this. So that is very exciting. We'll include a link to that in the show notes as well. So I saw we had some questions. If you have any questions, please comment them in the chat and we'll get them answered. I saw Esteban had one, but just waiting for him to send it in. But yeah. All right, maybe he's away from the computer at the moment. So if anyone has questions after the live, you can always type them in the comments or email us at hello@joinmentally.fit.com, and we'll get them passed along to Andy, or we'll post in the group so we can get them answered. So please let us know. Looks like, oh, here's the question. So Esteban wants to know, he's a question related to language, on how shifting language from negative to positive or neutral works when it comes to mental immunity.
That's a really perceptive question, I think. So I think we all like the people around us to have a positive attitude toward things. And there's lots of research that suggests that a positive or hopeful attitude helps us both psychologically and socially. So that's something we look for in the people we have dealings with. When you come out of the gates as somebody concerned to think critically about other people's thoughts, that's easy to interpret as negative. That's easy. So even if a critical thinker is really trying to help you refine your thoughts and trying to help you in that way, it can feel like an assault. It can feel like an attack, especially if you hold your beliefs very tightly. That feels like a negative thing. And I actually think that the whole critical thinking paradigm sort of inclines us to do idea testing in a kind of a suspicious or negative frame of mind. And that's not ideal for helping to create dialogue about deep questions or helping people, shed conspiracy theories, for example. So bringing a positive and an affirming attitude into dialogue, I think, is really important. That being affirming doesn't mean you have to agree with everything the other person is saying, but try to show that you respect them as a person and that you're willing to listen to them, even while you're gently raising questions about the beliefs and trying to help them see those beliefs more clearly. And by the way, clarifying questions here are marvelously powerful. If we withhold judgment until the 7th or 8th question we ask and simply just try to clarify for the first 6 or 7 questions, you can go a long way towards bringing the temperature in a conversation down and helping someone feel heard and receptive to the kind of questions that might actually change their way of thinking about something. So delay the critical questions, focus on the clarifying questions, and your conversations are likely to be much more fruitful.
Yeah, it's a really great point. Kind of keeps that defense mechanism from coming online when we feel heard, we feel validated, and then we're more open to hearing what someone else is going to say.
Exactly. Nicely said.
Yeah, so we've got another question from Marion. So Marion says, all right, so I was around someone this weekend that was negative and challenging. I talked to her about it and she couldn't get past her concept that I did something wrong. Do I drop this person as a friend or an acquaintance? Relatable. I understand where you're coming from on that.
Yeah, I do. That can be a hard situation. I guess I would encourage, Marion, I guess I would encourage you to use clarifying questions to see if your friend can state precisely what it is you did wrong. Because if it is something, if you did in fact do something wrong, then maybe the thing to do is to say, gee, I'm really sorry about that. You're right. That's not something I should have done. And that's one way to repair the relationship. But it could well be that she can't express it well, and that it's her own lack of clarity that has her clinging to the feeling that you did something wrong. And if that's true, she may never be able to let go of it. Give her an opportunity to see that with clarifying questions, and maybe you can salvage the friendship. I'm not an advice columnist, but I'm doing my best to simulate one here. Maybe that'll help.
Yeah. Yeah. And it's hard to say, Marion, we don't really know enough about the whole situation to really say, but I think all of what Andy has said so far would still apply. Just, be open-minded, come to the table with an open mind, and just seek clarity around exactly what the challenge is. But that's a great question, and thank you for writing in.
Marion does elaborate here that this friend complains a lot about people. I try not to surround myself with complainers. And the tendency to complain about things can sometimes get pretty entrenched. If you really want to help this friend, you might help them develop a mindset where they can let go of the need to complain and begin to see and feel and experience joy again. That would be a really nice thing to try as a friend, and I wish you well with it. But at some point, you might just have, for your own sake, you might have to say, I'm sorry, I can't help you.
Andy, I think you'd make a great advice columnist. I think you could do like an Ask Andy segment. That'd be awesome. But yeah, so since we don't have any more questions at this time, I want to end this with our final question. Since this is, we are the mentally fit community, we like to ask, what does it mean to you to be mentally fit?
Yeah, so I've certainly gone through physical fitness crazes in my life. And I've also suffered mental illness myself and gotten help and overcome that. I think what I think I'm maybe uniquely qualified to add to the conversation about mental fitness is this idea that the functioning of our mental immune systems is a really important part of mental health. So if your ability to spot and remove bad ideas is functioning at less than peak capacity, bad ideas can get into your head and begin to affect your well-being, your emotional well-being, as well as your ability to think clearly. So by boosting and developing your mind's immune system, I think you can both develop better judgment, but also begin to pull the ideational rug out from under some of the fears and emotional spirals that might be affecting your mental fitness in other ways. It's probably it's not a substitute for all of the other approaches to mental fitness and mental wellness, but I think it's a wonderful supplement or complement to them. So I actually look forward to the mental health profession embracing cognitive immunology as a nice an additional arrow in our collective quiver to help everyone experience mental health and mental fitness.
Well said. Thank you so much again for all of your time and sharing your knowledge with us today. Just really appreciate it.
Thank you, Dan. I really enjoyed your questions, and I appreciate the opportunity to share these ideas with your crew.